Next slide. Oh, yeah. Welcome, everyone, attending this discussion of pathways to a climate positive county. Buildings, consumption and mobility. Yes, less can be more. I'm Carl Held of the Climate Mobilization Montgomery County chapter and will be your moderator for this evening. This is our fourth in a series of regular webinars focused on creating the best possible county climate action plan with the broadest possible public participation. TCM is a national leader in the climate emergency and the climate truth, that there is an existential crisis unfolding around us, and humanity must change course or perish. As you may know, the TCM chapter here was one of the lead climate groups in getting the County Council in December 2017 to unanimously approve a resolution declaring a climate emergency with a strict goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2027 and 100% by 2035. Before we get started, I just want to briefly thank several TCM members who have been instrumental in planning this webinar. Nancy Wormers is hosting the Zoom meeting and providing technical support during the webinar. Dorcas Robinson is our backup moderator if needed. Louise Mitchell and Andy Miller are co-hosts monitoring the chat room and supporting the Q&A portion of the program. The remainder of the agenda includes keynote speaker presentations by Brian Seck and Neil Gorenflow, brief responses from our 4 respondents, a Q&A session with all the speakers as panelists and respondents as panelists, and all participants who are attending. And then we will have a wrap up and next steps. Next slide, please. So before beginning, I just would like to point out a few webinar protocols that we are following. Please stay muted. We are a large group today. If you are from outside the county, do use the chat to let us know where you are from and any affiliation. We would love to know who is interested in learning with us. Use the chat box at any time to submit questions for the Q&A. Please participate in the ignore that. The webinar is being recorded for sharing, and the link will be included along with key ideas for follow-up actions in an email to all registrants. Next slide, please. The overall purpose of this webinar is primarily threefold. We would like to familiarize you with some ideas about transforming Montgomery County into a climate positive environment and addressing the well-being of every resident in the county. We want to bring you the climate perspectives of some keynote speakers and several local stakeholders. And we want to open the door and encourage your participation in the review of the draft Emergency Climate Action and Resilience Plan, ECARP, to be made available this November and finalized in early 2021. Today's webinar focuses on the importance and ways of reducing demand for vehicles, buildings, and general consumption, highlighting some of the ways that the county can help reach its greenhouse gas emission reductions through lowering the need for many of the carbon-intensive products and services we use today, while undertaking measures to also enhance the resilience and well-being of all of us. Our keynote speakers will address 2 topics. First, pushing the gas pedal while pumping the brakes, and then second, sharing a 21st century climate change solution. Then our respondents will provide some brief remarks and provide insights on ways to address reducing demand at the county level. Finally, a Q&A session will enable attendees to address questions via the chat to specific speakers or open discussion by the keynote speakers and the panelists. So, I'd like to start by introducing Brian Seck as our first keynote speaker. Brian is a wildlife biologist who became an ecological economist during his PhD research at the University of Arizona. He is the founding president and current executive director of CASI, the Center for Advancement of the Steady State Economy. Prior to working full-time for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 18 years, prior to working full-time for CASI starting in 2017, he was a conservation biologist in the headquarters of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 18 years. He is the author of several books, the most relevant one of our purposes being Supply Shock, Economic Growth at the Crossroads, and the Steady State Solution. Brian, I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you, Carl, and again, welcome everybody to this webinar. I'm going to go straight to my slides and show you this one. Now, can everybody see that? Okay, so I decided to name this talk, Pressing the Gas Pedal While Pumping the Brakes. Economic growth and stable climate do not mix. And I suppose I might need a bumper sticker that would say, my last Prius was a mess too, but anyway. The key points I want to make here this evening are that the pursuit of economic growth is the ultimate driver of climate change. So serious talk of climate stabilization must include the steady state economy. In fact, climate stabilization will probably require GDP degrowth. And I think when we're talking about this, it helps to remind ourselves exactly what economic growth is. It's simply an increase in the production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so it's expressed in terms of GDP or gross domestic product. And that entails a growing population and or per capita production and consumption. And so the steady state economy, it's basically all of that except stabilized instead of increasing. And so here we compare a couple of unsustainable scenarios. That perpetual growth, that's not sustainable. And this is what demarcates carrying capacity in ecology, this K up here. And of course, perpetual degrowth wouldn't be sustainable. And so that leaves as the sustainable alternative, the steady state economy. And it's not, can't be a flatlined economy. Hopefully it's mildly fluctuating and ideally around some optimum level. And that explains our logo at CASI. You see the sigmoid curve ending in the steady state economy. And I hope people get a chance to go to steadystate.org and you will see the world's only real-time previous 12-month rolling GDP meter. Right now we have it rolling backwards because of COVID-19, and we're going to have to reset it forwards pretty soon with what's going on now in China, and it's going to be everywhere pretty soon. And of course the vaccine part, that's great. The GDP growth part, not so great, as we'll be talking more about. So in the economy of nature, that's all the non-human species out there on the planet, we know that it doesn't happen. There is no economy of nature unless we have those producers at the base. Producers are plants. They literally produce with the process of photosynthesis. And when you have enough of them, then you can have communities of primary consumers, the animals that directly eat the plants. And with enough of those, then you can also have secondary consumers like omnivores and predators. And throughout this economy of nature, you have various kinds of service providers too, like scavengers and decomposers and pollinators. Well, the human economy is structured the same way. In fact, you could say it's part of the economy of nature at the apex, but it's structured the same way. It has producers at the base. These are the agricultural and extractive sectors. If you don't have surplus there, you don't have the rest of the economy. You don't have any manufacturing. And if you do have plenty of surplus, then you can have all kinds of manufacturing, from the heaviest to the lightest, as well as the plethora of services that we have in this current, well, in the American economy of the last number of decades, for example. So I want to double down on that phrase, in the aggregate. Economic growth is always, it's a macroeconomic process. So it's not more solar panels here and less gas pumps there. You know, it's more goods and services in the aggregate. So it's the growth of the integrated whole with that trophic structure that we just discussed. And yes, there can be some sectoral adjustments. So this is what the process of economic growth looks like, given that trophic structure. These levels, we call these trophic levels in ecology and in ecological economics. And so economic growth entails this expansion of that trophic base. And so let's take a look around the world now at some of the scenes that demonstrate that trophic structure. So here we have a factory farm field of soybeans, probably Roundup ready. And here we're flying over Kansas, where the Oglala Aquifer provides the water for irrigating grain crops. That's what it looks like on the ground. Here again, probably a soybean crop and probably Roundup ready. Very fragile kind of false ecosystem. Here it is in Saudi Arabia, pivot agriculture. And that's what it looks like on the ground there. And then this is what it starts to look like when the aquifers start to dry out, like the Oglala is. And also when we get climate change in many regions, the warming and drying effects of climate change in particular. But you know, just about everywhere in the world where there are decent soils, so you can have that base of the economy, the trophic base, even if there's plenty of water, there's water stress, because where there's plenty of water and plenty of soils, there are plenty of people and plenty of economic activity. So you see all kinds of stress, crowding and stress and overuse of water, no matter what the particular type of agriculture or part of the world you're in. And then, of course, you know, so going beyond just the growing of crops, we have other extractive sectors like domestic livestock production, with all the overgrazing that causes out west over hundreds of millions of acres. And of course, we have the dairy business, and in places like California, we have about 55% of that water supply going for dairy farming and of course produce. And of course, you know, intensive domestic livestock production like this is quite a mess. And so you know, we go across all the agricultural sectors and then into the extractive sectors like logging, which has gotten more and more intensive over the decades here, with clear-cut logging in the Northwest and mining here in the case of open pit mining. And so after you have a lot of that kind of agricultural and extractive activity, then you can have the heavy manufacturing, like these activities, which take a lot of energy, of course. And if you have plenty of this, oh, pardon me, actually, we might include in that category the infrastructure. That's some really heavy manufacturing to get this stuff constructed. But that's what we need, you know, to transport the power and the water and the products and the labor. And so after we have plenty of that, then we can get the light manufacturing. And, you know, just a little snippet of exempling here. I mean, you know, there's so much light manufacturing now that even the manufacture of the boxes to ship it all is becoming quite something, right? Just think all those Amazon boxes right now. And eventually you get up to the lightest types of manufacturing, like computer chip manufacturing. And then that grades into what we might consider the lighter types of service sectors as well. sometimes referred to as the information economy. But I'm not a big fan of that phrase because, you know, it sometimes connotes something different fundamentally when there isn't anything different fundamentally. That those the service sectors, you know, they don't exist except to serve all the other sectors. Otherwise, they're going to be irrelevant to GDP. And remember, we're talking now about economic growth. And so here we are, a bunch of service providers, and, you know, sure enough, these services are going to all those other sectors we already looked at, like in this case, you know, heavy extractive activity. And of course, for that kind of activity, always at the very base is the energy sector. And, you know, some scenes from that, and we would hope that we have more of what's on the bottom and less of what's on the top, especially the upper left, those tar sands mining in Alberta. But on the other hand, you know, just to replace a single major oil field, just think of the acreages of this that are required. Where's the biodiversity then? So there's no free lunch here. There's no green growth. And furthermore, there's always got to be the tailpipe. I say got to be because I mean pursuant to the second law of thermodynamics. There will be waste. There will be material and energy waste. And those wastes increase as GDP grows. They're not always the exact same type, but in the aggregate, once again, we're talking about in the aggregate, waste stream increases. So that's why GDP is such an outstanding indicator of environmental impact. And environmental impact, that's where the carrying capacity comes in. You know, if you tear up the environment till it no longer supports that agro-extractive base, the economy is done. Or, you know, it's at least going to taper off and it may crash. So here's an example, the one that's probably most relevant for us this evening, with CO2 very much a function, CO2 emissions very much function of GDP. This graph shows rates of growth, first of GDP in the light green, with the slightly lagging CO2 increases. And but the fact is that virtually every major environmental problem you can think of, it has its roots in GDP growth. Now, some would say, but what about technological progress? Can't we just get ever more efficient and solve these problems? Well, it hasn't happened, right? It's getting worse instead of better. And here's why. This is the part that always evades us in our discussions of technological progress. Technological progress, it's not like manna from heaven. It takes heavy investment in research and development. And from the private sector, that means profits, and then we need public sector finance for some of the big stuff. But this turns out to be kind of a catch-22. You know, you need the research and development to maintain the profits, but you need the profits to conduct the R&D. And so when you really look into this, you find that there's one process that feeds the rest of it. And that's called economies of scale, which means reductions in average costs of product resulting from an increased level of output, more stuff, in other words. And it's at existing levels of technology by definition. So yes, you have increased efficiency, but concomitantly, not just concurrently, but concomitantly with increased throughput. That's why that waste stream continues to grow with GDP. So here's an example of economies of scale. You know, you have the same technology, internal combustion engine, single draft hull, and, you know, same kinds of containers even. And obviously this thing is way more efficient in terms of tonnage transported per carbon emission. But does that look more sustainable than this? Of course not. Sustainability is always a macroeconomic phenomenon. So you can't really talk sensibly about sustainability, and for that matter, you know, climate climate stabilization without dealing with the big picture and the macroeconomy. So let's talk yet a little bit about optimum scale or optimum size of that economy. We saw that the steady state economy is the sustainable alternative, but does that mean at the $88 trillion global economy that it was before COVID? What's the optimal size really? And for a lot of us, you know what, we're way past that. I'm one of those people. We're way past it. I would like to see way more of the wildlife that I got to see, 30 years ago, and more of the wilderness areas. But there are people out there that would like to see just about everything turn into a New York City. So at CASI, we view this as maybe the biggest challenge for democracy in the 21st century, maybe the biggest challenge for humanity, is finding that democratic optimum. And to do that, we have to look at other metrics. GDP is one of them, but we have to look at the ecological footprint and living planet index and so on. And I understand in Maryland for some time now that you guys have been measuring the genuine progress indicators. So that's been a great precedent. You in Vermont and maybe a handful of other states. We need more of that for sure. And then of course you're wrestling with this optimality issue at the county level, and that's another leading precedent-setting thing that's very commendable. But man, it's going to be a struggle.
Brian, if you could move towards in the next minute or two, trying to wrap up
Yep.
your presentation, that would be great.
It'll be a minute or two. Yep. So you're a citizen at the county, the state. In some parts of the country, we have tribal citizens, but we're all U.S. citizens, and in some sense, global citizens as well. And these are the questions then that we tend to overlook if we only consider one level of that citizenship. What's charging those electric cars? Where's that power plant? How's the carbon budget looking over there? And how about those wind towers and solar arrays? How are those even produced and maintained and junked and so on? So these are, at the end of the day, what we find to be the false hopes, so-called smart growth, dematerializing the economy. You saw the trophic structure, it doesn't happen. Circular economy, no, you can try to save, you can try to reduce waste, but there will be throughput. Purely renewable energy at a 2020 GDP, probably not. And the bane of steady state economists, this notion of green growth, the biggest oxymoron we think that's out there. So I have one more slide, and then the ending slides. The real solutions then, I think we find, are stem pretty naturally from what we just rejected. The real solutions entail a transition away from economic growth. And so it's the steady state economy at some level that's the sustainable option. And at this point, it may take degrowth toward that level for it to really be a sustainable steady state economy. So I guess, I don't want to leave anyone hopeless. It's a major struggle for sure. But I think the most positive thing that comes out of this is that now we know what the reality is. And that ought to make us feel a little bit better. At least we're not confused about, oh, should we go to the circuit? Should we find the green growth path? We can have GDP growth, economic growth. We have to get to a steady state. And by the way, I would encourage folks to join the GDP bad license plate club around the country. I got the Virginia one, so let's see who can get it in Maryland. That's it for my talk.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for your very thought-provoking ideas here that are worth discussing and learning more about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'd like to turn to Neil Gernflow as our next keynote speaker. Neil is an executive director of Shareable, an award-winning nonprofit news outlet, action network, and consultancy focused on the latest innovations in resource sharing. He's an author, speaker, consultant, movement builder, and editor of multiple books, including Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons. In 2011, he co-founded the Sharing Cities movement, now in over 100 cities worldwide. He helps organizations around the world meet their goals through sharing, including the Sharing Economy Association of Japan, Seoul Metropolitan Government, and the City of San Francisco. As a social entrepreneur, Neil's call to action is simple yet systematic. Let's share. So, Neil, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I appreciate it. And yeah, Brian, I just want to say I've been following Cassie's work for a decade and really appreciate it. I think we've exchanged emails. You know, I think sharing fits in nicely with the story of a steady state economy. And the presentation I'm going to give here will, you know, make the argument that sharing is a 21st century solution, you know, and very appropriate for climate change. And then give some examples of those solutions, working examples from around the world. And so I say that sharing is a 21st century solution for climate change because you know, this might be painting with a broad brush, but you know, 20th century solutions focused a little directly on carbon reduction and on the symptoms rather than the causes. And I think the steady state economy is getting at the root of the problem. I think also sharing strikes at the root of the problem as well. And you know, consumption is a major part of the global greenhouse gases budget. And there was a recent C40 study that showed that consumption in cities added, you know, 60% more to the budget than they had measured prior. Before they were just the C40 cities were just measuring, you know, consumption within their emissions within their borders from buildings and transportation mainly. So consumption has a major impact, and sharing is systemic because it changes the pattern of consumption, and it, if done right, can lower greenhouse gases. And you know, the sharing economy, I would not equate sharing directly with the sort of popular understanding of the sharing economy either, like Airbnb and Uber, because they became, you know, more business as usual than anything, and not necessarily a gain for, you know, equity or for environment, as many hoped that they might. So just to, I just want to share some stats that just underscore how I think effective a solution sharing is. So this comes, the data from car sharing really illustrates it, because car sharing has been studied of any sharing modality more than, you know, for decades, more than any other modality. So it's really good, you know, a really good like place to see the potential for it if applied broadly, right? So a 2010 UC Berkeley survey of North American car sharing users found that one shared car replaces up to 13 owned cars, and that car sharing vehicles were 10 miles per gallon more efficient than owned cars. They had more efficient fleets, and that 51% of users who joined didn't have prior access to a car. So there's a kind of equity component. People who didn't have access to a car could get access to a car. Another study showed that car sharing boosts household real income, because if you shed a car, that can, in North America, it's like $8,000 a year to own a car, and 80% of that goes outside the local economy. So for every car shed per household, that's $7,000 for the household roughly, and then $7,000 for the local economy also, theoretically. And car sharing can also build social capital if car sharing operator is cooperative, nonprofit, or transit oriented. really focused on benefits for the community and really leveraging the citizens and their energy and input. So sharing has this multifaceted systemic kind of impact. Next slide. And let's see. Yeah, no, the one before, please. Okay. Yes. But as we all know, as Brian so well pointed out, our society is designed for almost maximum consumption. It's for growth, but also, the policies in the United States, particularly the policies in housing that we pursued in the 20th century, particularly our intense focus, unlike anywhere else in the whole world, on single-family homes, is a huge driver of consumption. And so there is a kind of set of institutions that support this goal. This is the goal of our society, actually. It's kind of, it's supported by this institutional matrix, right? So if we want lower consumption, we need to change the institutional matrix to get a different result. We need an institutional matrix for sharing, for lower consumption. And this matrix would include things like, culture, technology, regulation, law, economics, business models, and infrastructure to support sharing. And so, in the slides that follow, I'll focus, as I said, on some working examples of sharing services and infrastructure that I believe represent a 21st century approach to climate change that's systemic, that doesn't focus narrowly on just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but has kind of multifaceted positive impacts. Yeah, I'll start sharing some examples. So yeah, next slide. So City as a Commons, this is a picture of the main square in Bologna, Italy. And in Bologna, they started this City as a Commons program with new regulation, and it really redefined citizens legally in the city, not as just receivers of services, but also provider of services, of agents that actually take care of the city and maintain the resources. And that sets a kind of new frame where sharing and collaboration become a part of everyday life. And this is kind of part of the idea of the Sharing Cities movement that I helped catalyze and that we've been a part of and helped support around the world. And so that's a kind of new story for a community, for a city, for a county, for a country, right? Is where the citizens have much more agency and work together on a daily basis, a kind of lifestyle to make their communities better. Okay, so next slide. And you need a kind of physical infrastructure to support that also. This is the kind of mold that opens up opportunities for us to connect with one another and collaborate and create local kind of projects and enterprises that help us share resources and use resources more efficiently. So Superblocks in Barcelona is one such thing, where they set off 9 square city blocks, and inside those city blocks there's much lower traffic and lower speeds for cars, and this creates much more street life and space for people to connect and to live their lives, and for children to play, etc., and for people to meet. So that's also another like kind of stage setting sort of innovation, and that's actually going really well there. And they're thinking about expanding that to the entire city. Next slide. And in Sweden, they have a project called Sharing City Sweden. It's 4 cities that are collaborating, and they're building actually sharing neighborhoods from scratch. And 2 of those cities, one in Malmo, this is Sege Park, Malmo. This is a kind of plan or a mock-up for a sharing neighborhood here. And what it does is combine green building with the sharing economy to help support healthy low carbon lifestyle, basically. So you can, what we see unfolding is like the next step from green building, from going from green building to something like social building, where the design and this mix of services allow people to connect easily, build community, and also share resources. Next slide. Another example of this is the innovation of co-living, which is a kind of like updated, technology-driven, like boarding house, if you will. So, much smaller individual units, but more shared amenities, more shared spaces, spaces to play, to work, to cook, and to mingle, and socialize. And also often combined with a social calendar and sharing services like bike sharing and car sharing and co-working. This is a mock-up of the largest co-living development in the world that's under development in San Jose, which is just down the street from me. It'll be, I believe it's for 800 units. And these mega co-living projects are springing up all over the world. And in San Jose, they had to, the developer worked with the city for a new zoning code to allow this to happen. Next slide. And another trend that we see is cities and counties turning libraries, schools, and apartment buildings into sharing hubs. So this is a picture, I believe it's from the Library of Things and the Sacramento Public Library. And so what public libraries are doing more and more is loaning out more than just books, but all kinds of things: tools, bicycles, sporting goods, musical equipment, small appliances. All, they have the infrastructure already there set up to loan out these things, and they're doing that more and more. This is a growing trend that we're writing about. We included in an ebook on the Library of Things that we published earlier this year, so which you can get on Shareable. So, and we also see this happening in schools and also in apartment buildings. Some cities like Seoul, South Korea are apartment building, centric. Huge tens of thousands of towers, or at least thousands of towers. And so, having a lending library in such a densely populated, area makes a lot of sense. You can serve people really easily. So that's also something we see happening, and a lot of promise for that as well. Okay, next slide. And similarly, we see this just beginning to happen. These are sharing hubs, but for transportation. And in Flanders, they call them Moby hubs, and they're transportation, like neighborhood level transportation hubs, right? So you have your kind of traditional modes like bus and taxi and train. Train might not be included depending on the neighborhood, but then you combine that with bike sharing, scooter sharing, and some other new modes of transportation. And in Flanders, they just passed some legislation or some new funding that they will develop 1,000 Moby hubs throughout the region. So that's really cool. And this is really, I think, inexpensive and energy efficient greenhouse gas, friendly way to make mobility more accessible. Have a mini transportation hood in every neighborhood. Next slide, please. And similarly, one trend that we see at Shareable and are writing about and publishing about is that there are these umbrella organizations that are springing up to support small community projects. With small community projects like sharing projects like time banks and tool libraries and so forth, they suffer from a lack of resources often. And so this ecosystem or umbrella strategy really can help support these kind of micro sharing enterprises at the neighborhood level. Next slide. And this is just an example of some of those, like a time bank and independent co-working spaces, bike kitchens, CSAs, tool libraries, little maker spaces, repair cafes, and what have you. So next slide. And this is, you know, I think a nice combination of like going for directly for a climate solution and also using sharing to enable that is an energy efficiency tool library. This is the smart, from the Smart Building Center. And these are often very expensive tools that builders might not have on hand, or homeowners doing self-improvement might not have on hand, but they can get them and use them and start building for more energy efficiency. And you know, they're using software to run this from a company called MyTurn. That's one of Shareable's partners. And they are helping power like this tool lending library movement across the world. So next slide. And here's just, you know, food sharing is also one of the things we see more and more of. And this is Food Cloud out of the UK. And they're having a huge impact just by taking the food that is not market ready or you know, can't be sold, whatever is excess, and funneling it through volunteers and through their network to food banks all over the UK, and you know, feeding, you know, creating millions of meals and saving millions of dollars, and also, you know, diverting tens of thousands of tons from you know, landfills. So next slide.
Neil, are you, can you?
Yeah, we're almost done. Just
done. Great.
we're right at the end, Carl. So I just wanted to share just a few examples. There's many, many more, and I invite you to get our free guide from our book, Sharing Cities, Activating the Urban Commons. Just go to that tiny.cc link there and download it. And you, in that process, you get a chance to sign up for our weekly newsletter, which has the latest news about sharing around the world, all the coolest innovations and so forth. So please get our book, sign up for our newsletter, stay in touch, you know, drop me a line. If you're starting a sharing project or you want to integrate sharing into your community's plans into Montgomery County or elsewhere, then give me yeah, drop me a line. Love to help.
Thank you, Neil. That was great. There were a lot of very interesting concepts there and examples of sharing across the globe. So it's
yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Carl.
Bring that all together and give us some awareness of that. That's great. So we'd like to move on to 4 respondents, local respondents that we have that will provide some their perspectives and insights of what they heard from the 2 key speakers, and also give their own examples of ways that we can work toward reducing our general consumption and activity to help bring down greenhouse gas emission levels. So we want to start, well, let me mention all of the 4 to begin with. Neil Seldman is, Seldman is a director of the Waste to Wealth at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance here in Washington. Jay Kaplan is a member of the Eastern Village Co-Housing Unit in Silver Spring, Maryland. Michael Hindle is a principal with Passive to Positive in the Baltimore area. And Gina Mathias is the sustainability manager for the city of Tacoma Park, Maryland. So we're going to start with Neil and let him make some initial remarks, and then we'll go from there.
If Neil's speaking, we're not hearing him.
Neil is on mute.
I am so sorry. Thank you for letting me know. I work for the Institute. We work very heavily in Montgomery County on waste issues, composting, anti-incineration, and we work with the grassroots in Montgomery County and as well as surrounding jurisdictions. Our work at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has been guided by the history of steady state political theory and economics. And in fact, we feel that local self-reliance is a steady state situation, and that's what we're striving to do, and we have been for close to 50 years now. I think we all know what we're facing, and I have nothing to add to the presentations other than a discussion of strategy. I think we feel that the strategies are focused at the local level. When people who make the decisions feel the results of those decisions, it makes for a better local body politic. I don't think we have to go after the big government and big industry without focusing on the local level. You can move mountains at the local level. You can change zoning for energy, for building materials. You can force economic change in the production system. The goal, of course, is to use local resources to the greatest extent possible, labor, capital, and the raw materials that flow through our city, including sunlight that falls on our roofs. And all of those can be captured. We just completed a study. 47 of the 50 states could produce all the energy they needed right now with current technology through wind and solar if the investments were made. And to get the investments, you need to change the incentives. To change the incentives, you have to change the politics. And to change the politics, you need voters. And hence our focus at the local level. I think I'll end by pointing out to one example of local self-reliance, or the spirit of local self-reliance from a couple of centuries ago. And that is the relationship between Henry Ford and Edison. They were friends, they lived next to each other in Jersey, and they visited each other regularly. And one day Ford was coming into Edison's house, and he pushed the gate, and the gate was hard to open. And he went to the porch and kidded his friend Edison as a great inventor, but he can't keep his front gate from being easy to open. And Edison responded by saying, no, it's working fine, because every time a neighbor comes to visit me and pushes that gate open, it pumps some water into my toilet system, and I don't have to pay for that energy for the pump. And that's the type of relationships we have to build. We think it happens at the local level, and we need to end our evaluation of success on the quantity of materials we use and base it on the quality of our lives. Those are my comments.
Thank you, Neil. Let's move to our next respondent, who is Jay Kaplan.
All right. Hope everybody can hear me. My name's Jay Kaplan. I live at Eastern Village Co-housing in Silver Spring, Montgomery County, Maryland. Eastern Village was one of the first residential LEED certified buildings when it was created back in 2004. And my contribution today is sort of looking at how do we live our lives to allow a steady state and sharing and the other things we've heard today, how we actually live those lives. For those who don't know, co-housing is a way of living cooperatively with other people. Ours is legally a condo. I was on the design team when we rehabilitated a 50-year-old office building 15 years ago into 67 condo units. So Eastern Village and co-housing together allow us to live a life of more with less while consuming less. We've got smaller homes that lead to be more thoughtful about the stuff we have. Our particular home is a two-level condo, a two-level unit with a spiral staircase to save space. It's under 900 square feet for two of us, but it feels luxurious. We at Eastern Village co-housing here, we have 3 shared guest rooms, which mean we avoided building and then for the last 15 years, heating and cooling all the spare bedrooms that would be typically have sat empty most of the time or just filled with stuff. The building's got multiple share closets where we put everything from beach chairs to camping equipment to pet carriers that are available for shared use of the members. It avoids the owning and storing of that one more thing that you use only once or twice a year. We have a goodwill room where members place extra items, and many of those are claimed by another member right here. Anything else goes to charity. A little less than a quarter of our households intentionally don't own a car. They either informally borrow one from another member or use one of the car sharing zip cars that are in the county garage right out back of them. Of the households that own a car, virtually all just own one car. And there's several electric and plug-in hybrids that are charged in charging spots in that same county garage. This is all made easy by having a bus line right out front, and we're only a short walk from the Silver Spring Metro. So even those that have cars, they're used what we call car light. The smaller homes are far more livable due to a dozen different shared spaces, such as game rooms, kids' rooms, a library, a workshop. And unlike the party room in a typical condo, they're used like and they feel like extensions of our own home. We have a few optional meals each week, and it allows sharing of resources as well as building a close-knit, resilient community. So overall, we've learned how to less physical space and a closer community. It lets us lead a life sort of where less is more. Answering one of the points or questions from the chat, we have geothermal wells in our courtyard, and we heat and cool with ground source heat pumps, which works amazingly. That's sort of my contribution to this discussion is that it can be a life, you can have sort of steady state, you can have less stuff, less growth, and it can be a really engaged and resilient and community rich, engaging life. So, thanks a lot. That's what I've got.
Thanks, Jay. That's very interesting housing project there. I've been there. Very, very well done. So now we'll turn to Michael Hindle as the next respondent.
Hello. Thank you all for inviting me, and thanks for the prior presentations. They're really exciting. Excellent. My name is Michael Hindle, and this is the splash page just shows my two companies, Passive to Positive. We do passive house design for positive energy buildings or low impact buildings. And I'm a partner with architect Carrie Beer, and she's a permaculture designer as well in Common Ecology. Our belief generally has been that green building and green standards are generally about being marginally less bad. And our whole premise is that we are going to try to do regenerative design in every possible instance if possible. And that's what our approach is all about. The next slide here is I'll show a couple examples of my work, and then I want to get into the 6 main points that I took away from the prior talks and also what I thought might be important to the county. Weinberg Commons is the first passive house retrofit apartment buildings in North America. In Washington, DC, I was the energy consultant on these buildings. This next slide is, incidentally, this is all affordable and supportive housing. This Barry Farm redevelopment as by POA, Preservation of Affordable Housing Mid-Atlantic. And these are 3 large mixed-use apartment buildings. This is all new construction. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm getting a little bit of noise coming through.
In France. They had even met Napoleon. Hoping again that Napoleon.
There's someone that's unmuted. Please mute, please.
So in any case, Barry Farm redevelopment. Okay. So it's a redevelopment of an entire neighborhood. All the buildings will be passive house certified. Also, we're doing everything we can to choose. I'm fighting hard for low carbon materials, and they'll also be provided with solar and backup batteries. Urban Village is with Somerset Development, also in Washington, DC, with Eric Colbert and Associates Architects. This is a really wonderful project because it sits nicely within the neighborhood. It's not a massive scale project, and it's doing passive house, certainly, but also we're doing low carbon materials, including a cross-laminated timber podium. So concrete is a very high carbon material. Cross-laminated timber is actually a carbon storing material. It's a long growth cycle, so it's not an immediate impact, but it is part of the recipe for a sustainable future. Okay, so basically I wanted to hit with a couple principles, and these relate, I think, to Brian and Neil's presentations. The first one is we cannot, as Neil said, you know, we've got to sort of degrow without qualitatively decreasing the value of our lives. Passive House is an energy standard, and it's a methodology, and it reduces operational energy consumption by orders of magnitude. This is not 20 or 30% more efficient. This is 90% more efficient for heating, 70% more efficient for cooling. So it vastly reduces operational energy. We have to do this across the board. Also, number two is embodied carbon, because these yellow vertical lines on this chart represent the cumulative embodied energy of constructing a project. And you can see that stays steady over the future because you spend it while you build it, and then it doesn't go up over the next 50 years or what have you. But the gray lines are the marching increased cumulative operational carbon. So we used to think, well, the operational carbon is vastly more important than the embodied carbon, because in the life cycle of the building, you know, the operational energy starts to dwarf the embodied energy. Well, that isn't true anymore when you have a climate tipping point just a few years out. So by 2050, you can see that embodied energy is still 50% of the total carbon associated with that project. So the time value of carbon is critical. Embodied energy matters a lot. And every building going up in the DC region is an embodied carbon nightmare and an operational carbon nightmare. Not everyone, but most of them. Okay, number three, we cannot build our way out of climate change with new green building projects. We simply must retrofit our way out, and anything we build has to be carbon negative. This chart here shows on the left, there are three bars. The one in red shows the one with a red rectangle shows the operating emissions of existing buildings. Now, the one on the far left shows the operating emissions of new construction. You can see that there are a lot less new buildings and they're more efficient. So it's minute compared to existing buildings. So any county strategy that wants to tackle operating emissions must tackle every single existing building they can get their hands on. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, you can see that new, large, heavy construction is very carbon intensive in terms of embodied carbon. Small, lighter buildings, like some of these mid-rise multifamilies I'm working on, are moderate embodied energy, but renovations are a fraction of what a new, large, heavy building is. So if you can renovate, not only are you knocking off the huge bar on the left of operating emissions, but you're doing so with the lowest embodied carbon. So for example, this is a project we're working in Pittsburgh. They were gonna tear down this building because the developer and the builder said, oh, it's easier to build new. I personally fought like hell to save the building for its historic character, but also because of its sunk cost of embodied energy. And we're doing a deep energy retrofit, adding 2 new stories on the Hebrew school in the back, and it's gonna house 45 affordable housing families and do it close to net zero. At our own house, we're doing a deep energy retrofit and site restoration. And this is sort of a testing facility for us as professionals, because what we're really endeavoring to do is work with local communities of modest means, because we know that if we deliver natural material, carbon storing material retrofits of existing buildings, we are providing a low tech, it's actually high tech, the highest form of tech, because it's exceedingly restorative, but people would call it low tech, but it's very high skill. It's therefore incredibly localized, and you cannot outsource this labor. And the ownership of the companies that do this work can be employee owned, etc. Okay, point number 4 is that the path to zero energy and resiliency must flow first through radical reduction in energy demand through passive design, and then active generation. And by reducing your demand overall, you reduce your reliance and you become more self-reliant, as others have spoken to. Okay, my second to last point is
Michael, yeah, if you could come to your bottom line.
It's my second to last slide. I'm just about done.
Great, thanks.
Yep. Efficiency must not come at the expense of toxicity. Spray foams, most rigid foam insulations, lots of these materials are exceedingly damaging to the environment and human health. So we have alternative regenerative materials. We just have to get our culture turned towards them. So that's the end of what I have to say. Basically, the imperatives are reducing operational energy demand, certainly, reduce embodied carbon, capture and sequester carbon in your building materials, reduce embodied toxicity, retrofit everything, and then you need resilient systems in communities. So I hope that all of that can be helpful to the conversation in the county. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Those are great points. Really appreciate it. Good job. So our last respondent is Gina Mathias.
Thank you. And it's going to be tough to follow all of the great presentations and thoughts so far. One of the things that really struck me of what we've heard tonight is this idea that we have to degrow. And that is going to be, I think, one of the biggest and most painful areas of tackling climate change, is reaching that steady state economy, as helping our cities and our regions and our states figure out how to manage degrowth in a way that is not painful so that we can do it. And as a small city in Tacoma Park, one of the things I've been thinking about is, where do we start? Where do we start reducing that demand? And I think the place where we have to start is the worst places, where we're getting the most emissions. And as we heard from Michael, and we know from our greenhouse gas inventories at the county and in the city of Tacoma Park, and Rockville and our whole region, it's our buildings and our transportation. And on the building side, it's coming from the use of fossil fuels in our buildings. And so one of the things that I think that we can think about as a county and the municipalities in the county is not just the new construction that's going up and the policies that the county is considering for new construction, large commercial buildings, because that's not going to help Tacoma Park reach net zero, because we don't have large new construction commercial buildings going up where we can demand those buildings are net zero. But what we do have is a lot of single family homes and apartment buildings. And what can we do with our single family homes and our apartment buildings to get them off of fossil fuels? And I think that one of the things that we can start talking about is, well, our fossil fuel appliances are going to die. Your furnace doesn't last forever. Your water heater doesn't last forever. And your gas stove doesn't even last forever. And so what are our alternatives? And can we start thinking about how we can get our local region to create some policies around helping people make the transition away from fossil fuels in their homes, in their existing buildings? You know, we heard a lot too about this idea of a sharing economy, and I love this, and I love how it can work at the hyper local level, like Tacoma Park. Years ago, Tacoma Park had a tool lending library, and unfortunately, for various reasons, that is no longer functional in the city. But I think that is also an area that we can really take hold of at this small local level to work on creating that steady state economy. I think that's it. And I know there's going to be lots of good questions. I can see things popping up in the chat. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Gina. Thanks very much. That was a great ending to the respondents' perspective on the keynote speakers' addresses and relating to our county. So I think I just want to pose one question to all of the people on the panel here, just to get your initial reflection without going too much in depth. But if you are looking at the issue of equity in the impacts of climate change and need to address that at a county level, how do you ensure that the benefits and costs are distributed equitably across the county when moving towards a steady state economy and trying to implement sharing programs in the county. How do you work that into your formula? I know that's a big question, but if I'll throw that out maybe to the keynote speakers initially, and then the respondents can follow.
Sure, Carl. I mean, I'll take a stab at it to start out. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is to look at single-family housing zoning, and you know, that is one of the biggest factors that created a unsustainable, unequal society in the United States. You know, it was designed to segregate and also to stimulate the economy, to stimulate growth. And so, you know, steps now are being taken in different places around the United States to kind of undo that and densify suburbs and, you know, increase the amount of housing. For instance, you know, in Portland, in California, they passed a new zoning measure where you can have up to 3 units on a single family lot. There was some new zoning legislation in Minneapolis, which they abolished single family home housing across the city. In Portland, they're densifying by redoing the zoning as well. And I think they said, if I'm remembering correctly, you can put up to 5 units on a single family home lot. And with and also in some of these schemes, there's an equity component where some of those new units coming on board would have to be affordable, below or at below market rate. So you know, that's a start of it. There's a city in Clovis, California. One thing that they did is they created a sort of fast track for putting an ADU, you know, a kind of mother-in-law suite or a tiny home in the backyard with pre-approved plans, and kind of and also other support, so that can, you know, happen fast. They can kind of ramp that up. So, you know, those are just, you know, a beginning idea, and, you know, the denser we can make our suburbs. And in the United States, you know, you know, many metropolitan areas have 50% and more of the urban land is suburban, right? So we're like, our land use is heavily tilted towards suburban. So that, you know, and if we densify, then we can get, you know, start down the path, you know, of reducing consumption and greenhouse gases significantly. I think that's a really important thing for both equity and for greenhouse gases.
Does anyone else want to contribute?
Yeah, so Neil hit up the zoning aspect pretty much, and sort of a natural complement to that are, of course, taxes. And there's a certain amount you can get done at a county level. I think you could actually institute some luxury taxes. You know, most counties have property taxes of some type already, and it's not rocket science, and it's not politically infeasible by any means to add, you know, taxes for things like Hummers and McMansions and gas-operated toys like ATVs and jet skis and those kinds of things. However, I want to kill 2 birds at 1 stone and go back to something that Neil mentioned before, or opined before, which was that we really don't necessarily have to get at the bigger political system. And I would have to challenge that a little bit, because there's only so much control you have at the county level, even for what happens within the county. So I'll give you an example. We have a proposal at CASI for a federal Sustainable Salaries Act, and that would operate on the 15 times principle or benchmark. No one in an industry or in a sector could make more than 15 times as much as the least paid in that sector. So that right away gets at one of the biggest equity issues out there, in a way with precedents already set, salary caps. But you can't do that at the, I feel that the county has to be a at state and national levels. So you can, you got your county government, but the county itself is sort of a collective citizen at the national level as well. And I just want to add, you also have monetary policy set pretty much entirely at the national level by the Fed. And that's like a GDP bulldozer running into your county from every which way. So you try to fight that off. Many counties have tried and failed. And finally, you got the military. What is that? Something like 60% of the carbon emissions of the USA is by the military. That's obviously a federal budget item. So I guess that would be my exhortation to county folks to take on those levels of citizenship.
Carl, I have something to add, I think, if we still have time on this question.
Yes, we've just got a couple more minutes, and then
Okay.
let me make one announcement here. I think that I'm going to wrap up our Zoom meeting in about 2 minutes, but we want to continue. We have a lot of questions we didn't get to from the participants, from the audience, and if some of the speakers or respondents will be willing to stay on to have an informal chat for another 10 minutes,
Sure.
really appreciate that. So, okay, go ahead, and we'll wrap up this question in the next minute.
Yeah. I understand Brian's comments. I would elaborate by pointing out that I think the old Catholic Church concept of subsidiarity plays a role here, and that is you solve the problem at the level closest to the people, all the problems you can, and then if you can't solve them, you go up to the next level. As Brian pointed out, a national military is a national event. On the other hand, our military is out of control, of course. It's probably the leading polluter in the world. But how do you control that? You control that through voting decent people into office, and that happens at the local level. So you really can't, in my mind, you cannot separate sustainability, the goal of driving towards sustainability at the local level, without seeing the impact at state and federal level and international levels.
I think what I was going to say, Carl, would sort of connect between Neil and Brian in a sense. I personally work for a lot of developers. I work for low-income housing tax credit developers. Now I know what's happening is they're taking tax credits for the wealthy and they're syndicating them, and they're using that. They're giving the tax credits to the wealthy folks using the capital, investment in affordable housing to guarantee a return, okay, to the financing organizations in order to provide rental apartments at just at a threshold of a livable rate, right? So in other words, we're sort of predicating everything on the corporate finance system and the wealthy. Now, we were finalists out of 895 folks. We were one of 15 finalists for an Enterprise Community Partners grant. And our proposal was to have local ownership of this low-tech, high-skill workforce, and local ownership through community land trusts or community investment trusts of, Baltimore has 16% vacancy. Now that's not true in a hot market like DC or Montgomery County, but every building that exists, if you had the unemployed, okay, from really underserved communities who were trained up in the most important skills for a low carbon future, and give them the ownership of the assets and their own economic sort of agency, then they would be the solutions locally to a statewide issue, a countywide and statewide issue. For example, you all have a housing authority in Montgomery County. They have relationships with the Maryland DHCD. Put pressure through your local housing authority to do nothing but low carbon building, and aggressively low carbon building. And it can be done. If anyone doubts that it's possible or affordable, you can reach out to me and I'll talk to you. But if you were to go then from your housing department locally and say to the state DHCD, which has been resisting this movement, then you're exerting local pressure at the state level. And one state, Pennsylvania, wrote passive house, low energy buildings into their quality allocation plan, which is what the QAP, it decides who gets the tax credits. And suddenly hundreds of multifamily buildings were being planned to ultra low energy standards. And then Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut all followed suit.
Michael?
Maryland is holding back.
Michael?
I'm done.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to just end now. All right, thank you very much, Michael. That was great. So, thank you. Okay. All right, I want to thank, we're going to continue an informal chat, but I wanted to thank all of you for joining today, with a special thank you to our keynote speakers and the respondents for sharing ideas. We'll be sending out in a follow-up webinar recording to all registrants. And I also want to mention that we would love to have you join us for the next TCM webinar on the pathways to the climate positive county on October 13th at 7:30 on decarbonizing our grid and our buildings and our transportation network. A flyer will be distributed with a link will be distributed shortly. Thank you very much for joining.